to 2019. And he will present to you on the theme Sri Lanka 75. We are in our 75th year of independence. So the theme is From Economic Stabilisation and Policy Reform to Sustainable Growth. Please be mindful that this session is being recorded, and we will then post the recording on the APSL YouTube channel once it's concluded. Dr. Coomaraswamy will present for about 45 minutes, and after that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. We are muting everybody during this meeting today, so please direct your questions to the chat, and we will be looking at the chat and trying to answer as many questions as possible within the time allotted. So without any further ado, we will now like to start the talk. And I'd like to invite the President of APSL in the UK, Dr. Mohan Srivatna, to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Nihanta. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this session. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the globe. We are really pleased and delighted to have Dr. Coomaraswamy today presenting this session. My name is Mohan Srivatna. I'm the President of Association of Professional Sri Lankans in the UK, the current president. The Association of Professional Sri Lankans in the UK, or commonly known as APSL, this was formed in 2004, and we are a registered charity in the UK. This association comprises of a diverse range of professionals belonging to various professional groups, ethnicities, religions, and living in various parts of the UK. We are also, most of our effort is volunteering. So most of our executive committee members and members put their time as part of volunteering to serve Sri Lanka in the main. Some of the projects we carry out have had significant impact, particularly for the development of Sri Lanka. We've got a range of projects, and I will introduce a few of them for the purpose of managing time. We've got a scholarship scheme which supports children, particularly underprivileged, low-income children in Sri Lanka, and we support financially, as well as we invite them to learn English through our English classes. And this has been going on for now 10 years. We are in the 10th year. We've got over 100 children being supported at the moment. We've got a disaster relief or emergency relief project, which was initially formed as response to providing flood relief and other relief mechanisms. But of late, particularly during the COVID period, we were very active in supporting Sri Lanka in terms of food and medical aid to the affected parties. Our cancer relief project provides financial and medical support to those suffering from cancer in Sri Lanka. We have a project to promote renewable energy, the Solar Villages project, and as part of that, we promote the establishment of model solar villages in Sri Lanka. We've established a number of such villages in Sri Lanka, and we continue to do that as well. In terms of building a bridge between Eastern and Western values, which is quite important for us living in the UK. We have a project named Living in the UK series. And this project is very much aimed at children who are growing up in the UK, but encountering both the Eastern values as well as Western values. And we do a number of talk shows for such children. In terms of networking as well as knowledge sharing, we have a project named Ask the Expert series. And within that project, on a chosen topic, we invite a number of professionals to share their knowledge, as well as for the audience to ask questions and broaden their horizons. Last but not least, WE Sri Lanka project, which is the project that is today hosting these, organizing and hosting these WE Sri Lanka talk. The aim being to support further development in terms of reconciliation, rebuilding, and as well as sustainable development of Sri Lanka. So what I've mentioned are a few projects that we do. In addition, we also have Florence de Silva Memorial Trust, which is specifically designed for children. And as part of that project, we've supported rebuilding of schools, donating books, and other support mechanisms for children in Sri Lanka. So as you can see, our project portfolio is quite diverse, and we hope you'll support us in. You have the opportunity to support us in various ways for us to continue to deliver the programs, as well as initiate any new programs as possible. So thank you very much, and hope you will enjoy this evening's presentation. Back to you, Gihant.
Thank you very much, Mohan, for that introduction to APSL. Next, I will take you through a very, very brief introduction to the WE Sri Lanka project that brings the talk to you today. So the origin of this project, as Mohan mentioned earlier, was in 2010 at the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka. The project was very much focused on post-conflict reconciliation and building togetherness and unity, and also raising funds for welfare of conflict-affected people in Sri Lanka. Over time, our focus has also developed further, and one of the very interesting outcomes of the gatherings we had, the early gatherings we had, was to support village development, and particularly renewable energy generation in a part of the Northeast affected by the conflict. And so that's where the WE Sri Lanka and Solar Village projects of APSL came together to develop a village, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. And now, at this time, we have diversified our sort of focus even more, and particularly with the climate and energy crisis being big issues, not only for Sri Lanka, but globally. We are now promoting thought leadership and raising awareness around matters of sustainability, as well as, of course, retaining a very strong focus on building reconciliation that continues as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, our origins go back to 2010 at the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka. We had events in 2010, 11, and 12 that brought together Sri Lankans from all communities in the UK in a spirit of understanding, goodwill, togetherness, to discuss issues, but more importantly, about our commonalities and what we can do together to forge a peaceful, united, and prosperous future for all Sri Lankans. We heard from eminent speakers, representatives from Sinhala, Tamil, Muslim, and Burqa communities, and also, very importantly, the younger generation. We debated the key issues, we celebrated our cultural diversity, and very importantly, raised funds to help and support people affected by the conflict. A key outcome of the WE Sri Lanka events in 2010 to 12 was supporting poverty alleviation and generation of renewable energy. We selected a village called Putiyanagar after a lot of analysis, which is near Mankulam in the heart of the Vanni. This village was actually resettled with refugees from the previous conflict, and reaching out to our membership, but generous donors as well as the corporate sector, we were able to fundraise and install then a 5-kilowatt solar roof at the community center in Putiyanagar, which is now connected to the national grid. And this means that renewable solar energy is being generated there to illuminate the community center, but also to provide electricity to run educational and skills training for children, youth, and women, which is organized by the Foundation of Goodness, our local partner in this project. Apart from that, of course, there is residual energy that the village development community is selling back to the national grid under the Net Plus scheme of the government of Sri Lanka. And that helps to raise another 150,000 rupees per year for additional support for the village. And the village community have the discretion on how that money is being spent. So that was an example of where the WE Sri Lanka and Solar Village projects came together. But the Solar Village project itself is more encompassing, and this is led by Professor Dharmadasa, who's also an APSL member. APSL continues to support the growth of solar villages across the country, and we are continuing to raise funds to develop even more villages in the north, the south, and the east, as you can see, and the west, so across Sri Lanka. At the moment, there are 3 ways that you can support renewable energy generation in Sri Lanka through APSL. There is the Raffle Solar Village fundraising campaign, the GoFundMe campaign. These are all available for you to connect and support us, or you can make donations directly to APSL. I'll be sharing links to these in the chat so that you can support us that way. And I'd also now like to ask Dr. Anuradha Samarasinghe, who's leading the Raffle Solar Village campaign, to speak to you very briefly about it. Anuradha.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Gihanta, for the opportunity. Before I just share my personal perspective on the project, I just wanted to give some basic information and facts. So the raffle draw, which is on an online platform called raffle.com, which is a UK recognized platform, it is still running. It opened about 7 weeks ago, and the closing date is the 15th of December, which is this Friday at 8 o'clock, where the draw will happen automatically on the platform systems. The cost of a ticket is £5. People can buy unlimited number of tickets. We have 3 prizes. The first prize will be equivalent to 10% of the funds raised, or £1,000, whichever is lower. The second prize being 5% of the amount raised, and the third prize being 3% of the amount raised. So yes, those are the sort of facts, and if you follow the link, you will be able to find further information and more details. Now, on a weekly basis, you know, we are all very busy. 2-3 times a week, I'm running around, and I might go to the supermarket and buy myself a sandwich, a drink, and a packet of crisps. And that cost me £4. Okay. Now, if you add £1 more to that meal deal, that is the cost of a ticket. So we feel that that is affordable to a lot of people. And so far, hundreds of you have responded and purchased tickets. We have also had further direct donations from the United States, and also a few who have bought from other countries. So it's an international platform. Anybody can purchase tickets. Now, a few weeks ago, my wife and I, we went out for a meal to a, you know, common restaurant chain, and we spent just over £50 for the two of us for a night out. Now, that works out to 10 tickets at £5. That's £50, 10 tickets. We had 100 registrants on this project today, on this call today. Now, if each one of you had bought 10 tickets, £50, you would have raised the full amount needed to sponsor one solar village, £5,000. Think about that, my friends. Think about that. What you can give today for this project will leave you a legacy that will positively touch the lives of hundreds of Sri Lankans for the next 20 plus years. So this festive season, I wish each and every one of you the good grace and good karma to find the charity in your hearts and donate today. This is the season of giving, and please give to the APSL Solar Village fundraiser. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anuradha. I think you've all heard a very persuasive case to support the Solar Village project of APSL, and I hope you will use the links provided to do so. So that brings us now to the main reason we're all here. It is the WE Sri Lanka talk from Dr Indrajit Coomaraswamy. So we've had a number of talks previously from Mr. George Willey, the award-winning, the eminent lawyer, the award-winning scientist Ravi Silva, the peace activists Prashant Divisier and Priyanta Vijayatunga most recently from the ADB, and they've spoken to you about different topics on reconciliation, renewable energy, and the climate crisis. Today, of course, we have Economist and the former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka addressing us about a very topical subject. We all know that Sri Lanka was in the depths of a very difficult economic crisis a couple of years ago, but I think Dr. Coomaraswamy will talk to us about how we are coming out of that crisis. So from economic stabilization to the policy reform that has taken place, and how the government is putting Sri Lanka back on the road to recovery. Dr. Coomaraswamy counts 40 years of experience in policy making and providing economic advisory services on both macroeconomic and structural issues at national and intergovernmental levels. He worked in the economic research, statistics, and bank supervision departments at the central bank, and was also secretary to the Ministry of Finance and Planning. There he held positions of director, and then later at the Commonwealth Secretariat assumed the position of deputy director of the Secretary General's office and later the interim director of the Social Transformation Program Division before going back to the central bank, of course, as governor. He has a honours degree from the University of Cambridge and a Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Sussex. Interestingly, he is an economist and a whiz, but also led the Sri Lankan rugby team. I thought that was a very interesting fact about Dr. Coomaraswamy, and also played first-class cricket. So a very well-rounded personality, absolutely. Dr. Coomaraswamy won the Sri Lankan of the Year 2016 by LMD magazine, the Central Bank Governor of the Year award from Euromoney, and of course, the very prestigious Sri Lankan national honor, Deshamania, was also awarded to him in August 2019. So it gives me great pleasure now to invite Dr. Indrajit Coomaraswamy to talk to you today on the topic economic stabilization, policy reform, and sustainable growth as we mark the 75th anniversary of independence. Over to you, Dr. Coomaraswamy.
Greetings to everybody. Thank you very much, Gihanta, for that very warm introduction. And I must thank both you and Mohan for inviting me to be part of the WE Sri Lanka Talk series. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. In terms of the high-level message that I'd like to convey during my remarks is to say that really very impressive progress has been made in stabilizing the economy over the last 18 months. But however, we are barely scratching the surface in terms of putting in place the structural reforms that are necessary to get the economy back on sustained growth. There are some green shoots, some good news that one can be pleased about, but we have a lot of work to do. So that is really, and also I would like to say a little bit about the poverty situation in the country, which is quite distressing when you look at some of the indicators. So those are kind of the highlights of the remarks that I want to share with you. And how I want to kind of, the narrative that I want to develop is first to say, give you some indicators as to how the economy has been stabilized. Then to make the case that macroeconomic stress has been the main cause of Sri Lanka's lack of progress over the last 75 years. And to talk about the sources of that macroeconomic stress. And then to go on to trying to assess whether the measures that have been put in place over the last 18 months will address a recurrence of that macroeconomic stress. And finally, to talk about the growth agenda and how we are faring on that. So that's roughly the structure of the remarks that I want to make to you. So what about the progress in stabilizing the economy? As I said, it has been pretty impressive. If you look at what the situation was 18 months ago, and you now take a snapshot of the key macroeconomic indicators now, there has been very significant improvement. As I said, that's only part of the story of what we need to do, but it is an important part. It's a kind of sine qua non. It's something that is necessary, but not sufficient. So how have we done in terms of stabilizing the economy? So if you look at growth, in the 2 years, 2022 and 2023, the economy is expected to contract by about 11%. There was 7.8% economic contraction in 2022, and this year it's forecast to be about 3%. So that is a pretty dramatic contraction in the level of GDP. So if you look at the level of GDP, by the end of this year, it's going to be 11%, almost 11%, less than it was in 2021. So it's probably going to take us about 3 years to get back to where we were in 2021 as far as the level of GDP is concerned. But the third quarter 23 data for GDP is expected anytime now within the next week or so. The Census Department will put it out. And after several quarters of negative growth, growth may well just turn positive. It may be a little below zero or a little above, but we are beginning to turn the corner in terms of getting positive growth. And certainly the central bank is confident that in the fourth quarter, growth will be positive. And then the IMF thinks that growth next year will be about 1.5%, but the central bank feels it will be more robust than that, about 3%. And then we hope to get it up closer, moving towards 5% going forward. So the IMF forecast for the next 10 years sees growth averaging about 3%, which I think is pessimistic. We should be able to do better than that. And I'll talk a little bit about how that can be done. So on the growth story, we are moving away from negative growth. We are turning the corner, but it's a fairly long haul. I mean, it's going to take us 3 years to get the GDP to the level it was in 2021. On inflation, I must say the central bank governor, Dr. Veerasinghe, and his team have done extremely well. Inflation peaked at 73% in September 2022. And in September this year, it had been brought down to 1.5%. It's gone up a little bit to 3% in October, and it may go up a little bit more towards the end of the year, because as VAT, the higher VAT kicks in at the beginning of next year. But the central bank is confident that it can maintain inflation within its target of mid-single digits. The target is 5%, 2% either way. So they are confident they can keep it down. So when you think where it went to 73%, clearly significant progress has been made. And the governor was absolutely right. He hit inflation very hard at the outset when he took over in April of 2022. And of course, there are kind of fairly long and variable lags involved in monetary policy transition. So though they hit inflation hard as far back as April, it has taken, most of the subsequent year to get it down to where it is now. But they've done well, and I'm pretty sure they will do the government will do what is necessary to keep inflation within the target. Then on the external side, on the day that we declared the standstill, which is a polite way of saying the day we defaulted, on the 12th of April 2022, our usable external reserves was down to $25 million US, 25 million. Now, the rule of thumb is that you should have about 3 months worth of import cover. Now, our import bill with the restrictions, etc., has been averaging about 1.5 billion. It was much higher before the crisis and the pandemic and the crisis. But even if you take the post-restriction import numbers of about 1.5 billion, so 3 months is 4.5 billion. So that is the comfortable level of reserves. And we were down to 25 million. In fact, 3 days after the standstill was declared on the 12th of April, we had to make a coupon payment of 200 million, which is why they had to basically declare a soft default before we kind of had a hard default. So that's where we started on the 12th of April, 2022. Reserves today, usable reserves today, have gone from 25 million to a little over 2 billion. Total gross reserves, usable, and People's Bank of China swap, which is not usable at the moment because of the conditions attached to it, are about 3.5 billion. But that swap is the yuan equivalent of about 1.5 billion US dollars. So in net terms, we have usable reserves about 2 billion. So when you think of where we started from, 25 million in April 2022, clearly there has been a significant improvement on that front as well. So when you look at these key macroeconomic indicators, there's clearly been a significant stabilization of the fundamentals of the macroeconomy. But as I said, this is a necessary but not sufficient condition. What we have done is really achieved a low-level equilibrium. So these sound macroeconomic fundamentals have been achieved while the economy has been growing at negative levels. right? Economy has been contracting up to now. And with a contracting economy, it's obviously much easier to have these good economic fundamentals in terms of inflation and the balance of payments. We need to have these sound fundamentals when the economy is growing 4 to 5%. And we can't do that without structural reform. So we'll come to that later in the story. But as I say, significant and impressive performance in terms of stabilizing the economy. But we have to remember this is a low-level equilibrium of low growth. We have to get growth up and still maintain stability of the macroeconomic fundamentals. Okay, I want to now go backwards to look at history before assessing what has been done to address these macroeconomic challenges that we've had over the years. Really, at the time of independence, as you all know, we had a pretty favorable endowment. For instance, external reserves covered 18 months of imports at that time. And the public debt as a percent of GDP was less than 20%. It was 128% of GDP in 2022. So, and also we had these sinking funds to cover the repayments. But then we raided the sinking funds and eventually did away with them. So it was a strong economy at the time of independence. And we've gone backwards. Now, there are complex causal factors for that. There are social factors, there are political factors. But in my view, arguably the most significant causal factor has been the repeating cycles of macroeconomic stress, which is why we've had, 15, now this is the 16th IMF program. That's a reflection of these repeating cycles of macroeconomic stress. So what has caused this macroeconomic stress? The main causal factor has been the government's budgetary operation. The Governor, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, in an address he made to a very important meeting in Germany about a week or two ago on inflation, called it basically fiscal populism. That's what we've had for 75 years. We've had a toxic combination of populist politics and an entrenched entitlement culture amongst the people. And the two have fed off each other and have dragged us down. Now, that was augmented, the negative effects of unsustainable fiscal policies were augmented by fiscal domination of monetary policy, i.e., the central bank funded the government's fiscal deficits. These unsustainable fiscal deficits were basically funded by the central bank by issuing treasury bills. So the central bank participated in the primary options of treasury bills, and in common parlance, it's money printing. It's the most egregious form of money printing. That high-powered money is created, pumps aggregate demand into the system. The economy overheats. You have higher inflation, and some of this excess aggregate demand leaks into imports. So you have the budget pumping aggregate demand into the system through unsustainable deficits, and then you have the central bank really getting involved in fiscal dominance in monetary policy by printing money to finance the deficit. And also keeping interest rates low artificially to help the government to fund the deficit, and also to try to boost growth artificially in an unsustainable way, because the economy immediately overheats. So then if you look at the exchange rate, the other major instrument for macroeconomic policy, it was often kept at an overvalued rate. The idea being we had a high import component in our basic consumption bundle. In the old days, of course, we imported rice, which was they say baratagana, if you depreciate the exchange rate. But now we are much better in terms of self-sufficiency in rice, but still fuel, fertilizer, and a number of essential medicines are all imported. And clearly, if the currency depreciates, you have those prices going up. So when you have excess demand and it leaks into imports and there's balance of payments pressure, unless you adjust the exchange rate, this pressure is difficult to counter. And what we do is we hold the exchange rates steady by depleting. There is much more demand for foreign currency than there is supply. And the central bank then feeds foreign currency into the market out of its reserves. So that's how the exchange rate is kept up. And we've done this again and again, and often on one occasion, we spent up to 2 billion to keep the dollar steady. The rupee steady against the dollar. And another occasion, and all governments have done this. This is not just one government or the other. There has been a playbook. We have tried to drive growth through policies that end up overheating the economy. We have not done the difficult structural reforms which get the economy onto a sustainable path of growth. Instead, we create these sugar highs by pumping excess demand into the system through large budget deficits, through fiscal dominance in monetary policy, through an overvalued exchange rate. And this is something we've done again and again. All governments have done this. And, I think it was Einstein who said that, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing and expect different outcomes. If you use that definition, we don't come out looking very well, because we've done this thing again and again. We've overheated the economy with unsustainable macroeconomic policies, and then we run to the IMF to try to stabilize the situation. Then we get to make some progress in stabilizing the economy, then an election comes, and governments, instead of doing the tough things and getting growth and employment going, they do the easy thing, which is to have, pump up the budget deficit and get the central bank to finance it and keep interest rates down. The same kind of playbook is used again and again. So let me now, all this for I must tell you, there's a useful kind of quote. Way back in 1959, Professor Joan Robinson from Cambridge, she was very much a Keynesian. She was not a neoliberal economist at all, very much a Keynesian, one of the earliest experts on the People's Republic of China way back in the 50s. She came to Sri Lanka in 1959. I think during Mr. Bandaranaike's government, they got her down because she had the kind of policy orientation which that government was sympathetic to. But even she said, we were still on then, you Ceylonese have eaten the fruit before you planted the tree. I.e., we were living beyond our means, even in the 50s. And then we continued to do this throughout. Then you have to ask the question, how did we get away with it? How is it that for decades we lived beyond our means and still got away with it? And there, I think the reason is, when Sri Lanka liberalized its economy in 1977, it was the second country after Chile to do so. Of those economies which went down the inward-looking dirigists route, Sri Lanka was the second after Chile to liberalize. Chile liberalized in 1975, Sri Lanka in 1977, India in 1991. Okay, so clearly Chile couldn't be held up as a poster child for anything, because at that time it was under General Pinochet's dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship. So the traditional donors, basically the Western countries and Japan, saw Sri Lanka as the kind of poster child which they wanted to support. A country with a liberal polity and a liberal economy, they wanted to show good development outcomes. And in fact, in those days, there was a term called donor darling. Sri Lanka was the archetypal donor darling and received very, very generous amounts of highly concessional foreign aid. So that is how we basically fill the gap. In terms of we have to live beyond our means, and this very generous amount of concessional foreign aid meant that the situation didn't spill over into crisis. Every so often it became unsustainable. Every year, the World Bank used to organize a Sri Lanka aid donor group meeting in Paris. And all of the donors were around the table, the multilateral as well as bilateral. and the external financing gap would be presented for the subsequent year, and there'd be pledges to fill it. And when it was considered that the gap was unsustainable, then there would be an IMF program. And so there would be a mixture of austerity to reduce aggregate demand and plus the donor support to fill the gap. So this is how it went on. And those austerity programs were relatively light. In fact, Sri Lanka got away with it in the sense that when I was working in the Commonwealth and had exposure to many more countries, it was clear that Sri Lanka was treated relatively lightly. So we had this kind of process that we were going through, which didn't push us over the brink in the way we got pushed over about 18 months ago. So it was a manageable situation, but we were not transforming our economy in the way the countries, Asian countries to the east of us were. And I should say another reason why the donors were generous with us is not just because we had liberalized the economy early and we had a liberal polity and a liberal economy, but also the impressive performance as far as our social indicators were concerned. So the donors felt this country is using the money reasonably well. If you look at education, if you look at health, female participation in education, lots of things. We did well. And that helped us to continue to get these very high levels of highly concessional money. When I say highly concessional money, about 60% to 2/3 of this concessional foreign aid that we got from the donor community came from the concessional windows of the World Bank and the ADB. And at that time, the terms were 10-year grace period, 30-year maturity, and 1% administration charge. So those were the terms on which we were getting money to fill our external financing gap. So we were living beyond our means, and we were getting this money on these terms to continue forward. And when it got a bit unsustainable, an IMF program came in, kind of balanced it out, but again on concessional terms. So then how did this kind of rather, it was a disequilibrium, but at least this rather smooth process, how did it get disrupted? Well, we became a middle-income country and lost access to concessional money. That was a real paradigm shift, because as soon as we did that, we were exposed to rating agencies and international capital markets. Now, the problem was, though we got graduation, we achieved graduation. You get graduation when the per capita income goes above a certain threshold. Now, we went over the threshold. However, that growth was driven by non-tradables. It was sectors like construction, transport, personal services, public administration. That's even increasing the size of the public administration is also seen as growth. So these were the kind of things that drove the growth process and took us over the threshold into middle-income country status. Now, when you graduate on that kind of growth model, you do not earn or save foreign exchange, or sufficient foreign exchange is not earned or saved. So we started borrowing from markets because the whole Paris Club process ended because we were no longer a low-income country. So we had been living beyond our means for a long time, didn't really address that, went to markets and had a completely different paradigm. And we got to markets based on a growth model, which was not suitable to adjust to this new paradigm. Because as I said, it was growth driven by non-tradables. So we were not earning the foreign exchange to be able to support this living beyond our means, which we had been used to for some 75 years. Then not only that, we also had a problem because we had our tax, the tax collection in Sri Lanka was over 20% of GDP. You know, it came down to 8% last year, but it was over 20% up to the mid-90s. And we got most of that or much of that tax by collecting taxes from the tea, rubber, and coconut sectors, particularly tea. In fact, we built our free education and free health by really taxing the tree crop sector. But the surpluses in that sector came down as prices declined and as the extremely low living conditions of the estate workers increased somewhat and the margins came down, and also with nationalization, profitability came down. All that meant that the taxes from those sectors, which were a major part of the revenue base of the country, got eroded. But what happened was that the new sectors, which replaced the plantation sector as the growth sectors, like apparel, like tourism, did not pay taxes because they were given tax holidays. Now, you can justify tax holidays during the conflict period by saying that there was a high risk premium attached to the economy, and you had to give these tax holidays to get projects over the hurdle rate of return. However, even after the end of the war, we kept on with these tax holidays. So we graduate, on the basis of a growth model, which is linked to non-tradables. So we're not earning or saving enough foreign exchange. In addition, we are giving all these tax holidays and we are not collecting enough money as revenue, which meant that we became the most vulnerable category of country, which is a twin deficit country, with an unsustainable budget deficit and an unsustainable deficit in the current account of the balance of payments. Actually, the fragility of our growth model, if you compare us with the successful countries east of us, they drove growth by the size of their the surplus in the current account of their balance of payments. So that's what drove the growth process. That is basically export transformation. In our case, if you plot the growth over the years, you will see that highest growth is when the budget deficit is large. So and supported by, as I said, unsustainable monetary policy, fiscal forbearance and monetary policy. So our growth is pumped up by unsustainable policies. Sugar high is created by unsustainable policies, usually around an election, and which clearly, and at the end of the process, if you look at it, look at the last three elections. 2019, we had these tax cuts, and in the end, we ended up with the IMF. Okay, we could have gone earlier, we should have gone earlier, but ended up with the IMF. Then in 2015, the government that came in at that time, the Hapana government, came in January. In February, had an interim budget, which was totally unsustainable, designed to try to help them to win the parliamentary election. And by 2016, we were with the IMF. Then in 2010, when there was an election, again, I think the government of the day felt that there should be a peace dividend. And rather than getting a peace dividend through good reforms and good policies, created another bubble by, again, very large budget deficits and fiscal, the same playbook. So this happens again and again. Now, what is crucial is that it cannot happen again. If it happens again, in my view, it is quite possible that we will have a major social implosion, because I will come to the story on poverty later on. But we were a middle-income country, whatever said and done. Maybe the growth model was not the right one, but still, their incomes did go up and it went to a middle-income country level. So there were some buffers in the economy. So during the last 18 months, when the multiple crises hit, people did have some savings or had some assets or access to families or whatever, which kind of has helped them to tide over the worst of the crisis. Not very easily, but they managed. But whatever buffer there was, because we were a middle-income country at the beginning of this crisis, has now been seriously depleted. So again, if with these elections that are coming up, we play the same kind of playbook again, and we let the things get unsustainable, and then we have to bring in more austerity to stabilize the situation, it will lead to a social implosion. I'm pretty sure of that. Because we no longer have the buffers, and people are really, at the edge. So we have to get this right? And okay, so how about getting it right now? What are the things that how am I doing? Yeah. What are some of the things that have happened which are positive? So I said, right, the macroeconomic instability has been the main cause of macroeconomic stress, has been the main cause of the country's relative lack of progress. Now, I should have said one thing. Another reason why we got generous foreign aid was because of our social development. And I think I did say that, in fact. Sorry, yeah, because people thought we were using the money well and they were willing to write checks for us. Right. So now what has happened, hopefully, to try to prevent the kind of macroeconomic stress that we've had for 75 years? In my view, significant progress has been made. So if you look at the extended fund facility of the IMF, I won't go into the details of the extended fund facility because I suspect all of you already know about that now. But let me just highlight a few things. So in my view, there are two key pillars to this program. And we call it an IMF program, but I must tell you that when I was in the central bank itself advocated very strongly for both these frameworks to be put in place. In fact, they were. Certainly those related to the central bank, the framework were put in place, but they got reversed. So because of that, it is very important that these frameworks that I'm going to talk to you about are embedded in law. So that is what is happening. Now, clear frameworks are being established for fiscal policy and for monetary policy and the way the exchange rate is managed, and it is getting embedded in the law. So it's going to be much more difficult for a new government to come in and just change things, as has happened in the past. So what are these key changes that have taken place or are in the process of taking place? So as I said, the budget is the biggest source of instability, or has been for 75 years. There is a new fiscal management reform bill that will be presented to Parliament in the first quarter of next year. And that actually, again, strengthens the fiscal rules and ties the government's hands by law in terms of the way the fiscal policy is managed. We already have a Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which was brought in 2002. But it is extremely weak, and each time that the targets are due to be met, Parliament just extends the target, and it has been utterly toothless. This time around, there's going to be more teeth, and the operating target is going to be the primary balance in the budget. Now, what does the primary balance involve? It is total revenue minus total expenditure, leaving aside interest payments. That is, if you have a surplus in the primary balance, you are meeting all the current year's expenditure out of revenue collected in that year, i.e., you're not adding on to the stock of debt. Now, Sri Lanka, we have had only 4 years when we've had a primary surplus in the budget, since 1954. And 2 of those years were in 2017 and 2018, when the late Mangala Samaraweera was finance minister. In my view, he was an excellent finance minister. And he also allowed us in the central bank to do our work without interference. So he was able to achieve those surpluses. But even he, in 2019, an election year, was not able to achieve a primary surplus. But going forward, I haven't seen the new fiscal management bill, but I understand that achieving a primary surplus is going to be embedded in the law. Because if you look at the IMF's 10-year macro fiscal framework, it anticipates us achieving a primary surplus of 2.3% by 2025 and then maintaining a surplus throughout. So hopefully now, by having this framework of having to hit a primary surplus and meeting our current year's expenditure out of current year's revenue, will take away this source of instability in the system which came from the government's budgetary operation. So clear framework embedded in the law. Similarly, the new Central Bank Act, which has already been enacted by Parliament, gives the central bank greater operational autonomy. The governance structure has been bifurcated into a monetary policy board and a governance board. In the past, the monetary board, which was the governance entity of the central bank, had the Secretary of the Treasury as a member, as an ex officio member. Now, under the new Central Bank Act, there is no treasury representation in the governance structure of the central bank, in either of the two boards that have been created. So that's a major advance. Hopefully, that will reduce the prospect of fiscal dominance in monetary policy. So that is a key change in the Central Bank Act. The other thing is this flexible inflation targeting has been embedded in the law as the regime for monetary policy formulation. What does flexible inflation targeting mean? It means that the government, the finance minister, signs an agreement with the governor of the central bank on the inflation target. And the Bank of England has this, and I think New Zealand was the first country to start it. So there is a target given. But then the central bank is given operational autonomy to hit that target. And so the central bank, in fact, this is what was happening actually before the pandemic and this regression we had towards the crisis. And this is why it's important to put all this in law, because things which were happening just got reversed. And essentially, this flexible inflation targeting was being followed, a data-driven, forward-looking monetary policy, taking into account the fact that there are long and variable lags in monetary policy transmission. So all that had to be taken into account. The modeling and forecasting capacity of the central bank was being improved. All that was being done, and flexible inflation targeting was being pursued by the monetary board prior to the pandemic and the crisis, and it kept inflation in single digits for over a decade. But then it was all kind of thrown out in one fell swoop. In fact, the monetary board in, I think, very early 2019 or maybe in end of 2018, took a decision. The monetary board took a decision, of the central bank took a decision not to participate in the primary auctions for treasury bills. That, as I said, is the most egregious form of money printing. The monetary board took a decision not to do it. Now, the reason why you have to embed all this in law now, and it is now embedded in the law that the central bank will not participate in primary auction, is because you can have a change in government, and then essentially the monetary board was told by the government that they don't have to stick to the decisions taken by the previous one. And so that was reversed, and you had the central bank printing large amounts of money by buying monetary treasury bills. In fact, we worked very hard to try to get the central bank act.
It's now a sprawling campsite for displaced Palestinians.
In fact, we tried very hard to get the Central Bank Act done during the government, which finished in 2019. It got all the way to Parliament, but we ran out of parliamentary time. And we were very keen to get it done. For instance, if it was completed, if it was enacted, I suspect if we had got it done, we wouldn't have had these unsustainable tax cuts. Because if the central bank could not print money to fund the government, nobody would have dared to have these tax cuts that we had, which became a problem later on. So why I'm dragging this story out is to say how important it is that you have these clear frameworks and you embed it in the law. Essentially, we have to tie our hands by having this embedded in the law, so that we don't repeat. As I said, I told you what Einstein's definition of insanity was. So we have to break this cycle of inappropriate macroeconomic policy. And the exchange rate also, as part of the flexible inflation targeting, the exchange rate has to be managed flexibly to reflect the demand and supply conditions in the market. The central bank would only intervene if there is a disruption in the exchange rate because of some shock, which is exogenous and is not reflective of the demand supply dynamics within our foreign exchange market. If there is that kind of thing which switches, which kind of affects sentiment, the central bank could kind of intervene in the market. But otherwise, basically, the supply demand dynamics determine the exchange rate, and the exchange rate is the first line of defense against shocks to the system. So that's the framework that has been built up, and because it is embedded in law, hopefully, it is going to be more difficult to have the kind of macroeconomic policy making which has led to cycle after cycle of macroeconomic stress, as reflected in the 16 IMF programs that we have had so far. So those are the kind of improvements that have been put in. Another area where there is a significant improvement is the liability management and the whole government public debt problem that has kind of exploded in our face. As I said, for many years we lived beyond our means. We were funded with very cheap money. We managed to keep going. Then we graduate through a growth model driven by non-tradables, and we don't make progress in addressing the twin deficit, the balance payments deficit, or current account balance payments deficit, or the budget deficit, because the revenue is weak. And so we have to keep buying. So borrowing. We no longer have this annual meeting in Paris where the donors gave us money to fill the gap when we were living beyond our means. So that process was replaced by the government issuing international sovereign bonds. So every year we issued international sovereign bonds to fill this external financing gap. So this is the international sovereign bonds replaced the 8-group meeting. And of course, the interest paid on these international sovereign bonds range from about 6.5% to 7.5%. Remember, I told you the terms for the earlier concessional assistance. So we were now borrowing expensively. We were exposed to rating agencies. If we didn't have our rating high enough, we couldn't get this money which we needed every year. So in fact, from the central bank, it was made very clear to the government that these international sovereign bonds were only a holding operation. Because if you look at the World Bank's development update, which came out in October of this year, you look at page 9, there is a box on external debt. And it demonstrates that in 2017, 90% of the money borrowed in that year went towards repaying earlier borrowing. So we were basically borrowing to repay earlier debt. And this was recognized. And if you have insomnia, you can Google Sri Lanka medium-term debt management strategy. It will come up. It was published in, I think, about March 2019, jointly by the Minister of Finance and the Central Bank. And it had 3 pillars: reduce reliance on external borrowing gradually, because you have to do it gradually, because if 90% of the borrowing is going to repay earlier debt, if you suddenly stop external borrowing, you are going to be in big trouble. You're going to have a rollover problem and a massive gap in your external, in your dollar income, and how do you maintain your level of imports and repay the debt, etc. So we were trapped into issuing international sovereign bonds, and which were done on an annual basis. But the way out of it is essentially to run primary surpluses, bring down the stock of debt and the debt servicing, and at the same time increase non-debt creating flows like export income, remittances, FDI, foreign direct investment, portfolio investment into the share market, etc., and governments. All these things can be done. So I'm also, I can, maybe in the discussion, I don't want to go into details, because one of the kind of credentials I have acquired is to say that I was responsible for by having all these international sovereign bonds in my time. I don't want to have a defensive kind of set of remarks now, which we can hopefully, if anybody wants to, I can explain how that build up took place. But one thing to say is that, as I said, once we no longer had the Paris meetings of the donor agencies, we had to fill the gap, and the gap was filled with international sovereign bonds, and we had to gradually wean ourselves away from it. And before we could do that, or we didn't really follow the medium-term debt strategy that was announced in March 2019 was not really followed, and then we got into trouble. Now we have to revive some of those principles. And another important thing is that external debt was being managed in 3 different places. Bilateral and multilateral debt was being managed in the External Resources Department of the Ministry of Finance. Then commercial loans from banks and syndicated loans was being managed by the Treasury Operations Department. And the international sovereign bonds were being issued by the central bank. So there were 3 different places in the government which was involved in external public debt. So now I think the government is moving to have one agency, a debt management agency, which will manage the whole of the debt stock, which I think is an important streamlining measure. Then let me finally go on to say, before I get into the kind of forward-looking at, I should say something about, one of the things, there are 2 new things that have come in to the IMF program. One is they have put a floor to how much should be spent on social transfers. That 0.6% of GDP should be allocated to cash transfers as part of the social safety net. That's very unusual. I mean, people criticize the IMF for being blind to poverty and distributional issues. Well, there we are. They've actually got this floor which they've set. Now let me talk a little bit about poverty, right? So the APSL program is improving the cash transfer program. The amount is bigger. It's now 200 billion. I think it's almost a trebling of the outlay. APSL program, and it's better targeted. There's a welfare board that has been trying to get the targeting better, and then hopefully it's better designed. However, one can already see the politics coming into it. So it's crucial that it is the criteria which have been introduced by the welfare board with the support of the World Bank are maintained, and that those who deserve it get it, those who are eligible get it. Because if you extend the numbers beyond those who deserve it, then the people who deserve it are going to get less money. So this is the important thing. The targeting has to be right and the design has to be right. And there is some progress that has been made, but one can see that there's also political pressure coming to again politicize this. In the same way Samruddhi was, in the same way before Samruddhi we had, I think, the Jana Savya program. All those things got politicized. So this time around, hopefully it'll be better and that it'll be more effective. Let me give you a little bit about the poverty situation in the country. So now the numbers are really quite distressing. The majority of the people in the country are now in poverty or just above the poverty line. The poverty rate, which had declined to 6% in 2016, is now close to 30%. The World Bank estimated that it doubled to 25% in 2022. It is currently estimated to be around 30%. The UNDP-sponsored survey conducted in 2022 found that over half the population is multidimensionally vulnerable. This vulnerability is spread across the country. The World Food Programme has found that about a third of the children under 5 are malnourished, with 20% suffering from wastage. Nearly 2/3 of the population are borrowing or depleting their savings to feed their families. Healthcare has been foregone and education disrupted for the poor and the vulnerable. So that is a pretty distressing picture that is out there in the country now. And as I said, people have probably depleted whatever buffer they have, and we have to get growth going. And we cannot afford to slip up again by, repeating the same kind of mistake we've made before when elections come. And because people, another round of austerity will have quite, in my view, very serious consequences. Okay, so how are we doing in terms of the reviving growth? There are some positive signs. We have, as I said, we've had real difficulty with structural reforms, and those reforms, in a context of macroeconomic threats, it's difficult to do structural reforms. But now we have stabilized and we have to push through. So there has to be continuity on the stabilization program, and now a real focus and an acceleration on the growth agenda. So some encouraging signs in terms of what has happened as far as structural reform are concerned. For one, is the cost recovery pricing on electricity and fuel. Now, it is tremendous hardship for the people, but I think the way to support the poor and vulnerable is by having a very well-designed and generous cash transfer program. So you support the poor through cash transfers, but you don't disrupt the relative prices in the economy by subsidizing electricity and fuel, because you get perverse outcomes. And anyway, what has happened is that all governments over the years have got the CPC and CEB to subsidize fuel and electricity, but then they didn't transfer the money to pay the subsidy. So those subsidies were funded by the state banks. So the losses of the CPC and CEB sat on the books of the state banks. And because the state banks are considered to have the government behind them, the central bank and the regulator does not require them to classify and provide for these bad loans of the CPC and CEB. But now the chickens have come home to roost. You would have seen in this year's budget, 450 billion has been allocated for capitalization of banks. The private banks, I think there were asset quality reviews and they are in pretty good shape. How much time more do I have, Yanta?
Thank you. Yes, we have loads of questions coming through. So
Okay.
I think if we can summarize the rest of the presentation. Yes.
Okay, I'll get it done in a couple of minutes, 5 minutes. So that the movement to full cost recovery pricing will not only also improve the operation of the CPC and CEB, but also help the balance sheets of the two state banks. So that's a major reform that's been good. Then there are about 7 entities that have been identified for the divestiture. So, and the EOIs have been issued, and transaction advisors are working on it. Then there's an economic commission that is being appointed to look at investment, trade, and SME growth, etc., in a holistic way. So hopefully that also will move forward. So these are still all plans, right? So we need to get these things done. So there's a long overdue agenda. I'm going to run through it. One is factor markets, labor market reforms. We have very, very archaic labor laws which actually work against capital formation. We have to improve the investment climate. The one-stop shop has been talked about for years, but has never really worked. Investment promotion. We look at a country like Vietnam, which was able to get Samsung as an anchor investor and then built on that in a remarkable way. Whether it's a country as large as China or a country as small as Singapore, FDI has played a crucial role in getting the transformation of those economies. Our FDI performance has been extremely poor. So again, this economic commission hopefully will make a difference, but we're still early in the process, too early to say how we're faring. Then on trade agreements, Vietnam has 14 trade agreements. Now, we have one with India, and we signed one with Singapore, which we didn't really implement, and we have one with Pakistan. So now I think the Indian one is being upgraded. They're trying to finalize the trade agreement with Thailand by March, I think it is. And China, they're negotiating, and they want to join RCEP eventually. That's an aspirational goal. So again, we are starting to do things, but let's see how it all goes. The other thing is trade facilitation and more cleaning up the whole kind of bringing down the transaction costs of doing business across borders in Sri Lanka, and education, training, and skills development. So these are areas, in the 1980s, I was seconded from the central bank to the treasury to be Mr. Ronnie DeMille's bank carrier at that time. I used to go around listening to his speeches, and he used to talk about reforms. And when I was in the central bank from 2016 to 2019, I found I was saying the same things he was saying in the 1980s, in 2016 to 2019. We had not done very little, and we are still saying these are the things we're going to do. So this time around, we really have to do it. We can't go for this soft option of trying to create a sugar high by having, overblown, overinflated, unsustainable macroeconomic policies. We have to maintain stability with sound policies on the macro side and drive growth through structural reform in all these areas that I've been talking about. I'm happy to expand on it, but there are some positive news flow. One is the IMF Executive Board is meeting on the 12th of January. The second review will get done on that day. About $800 million will come into the country from the IMF, the World Bank, and ADB by the end of the year. That should give a boost to sentiment and confidence, hopefully. Then debt restructuring. The domestic debt was completed some time back. Now the official creditor committee made an announcement that they've come to a deal. I think it was last week. So that's also done. So we only now have the commercial creditors, particularly the ISB holders, to do. And that's the next piece in the negotiation. And hopefully that will now move forward. So these are two kind of very important milestones on which we are making significant progress. And there are a few large investments, largely, mainly driven by government to government relations. I'm going to pick three of them. One is the West Terminal, where Adani from India and John Keels are doing a joint venture. And interestingly, the US has given a loan of $550 million for that project. Then there is a large refinery being built by Sinopec in Hambantota. And we are having Adani is working towards another wind power project, large one in Mannar. And there is a large project in the dairy sector where Amul, which is a massive great operation in India, involving small dairy farmers being brought together. So there is a collaboration between Amul and Cargills in the dairy sector, which can have a transformational impact. So these are some of the interesting things. And the interesting thing is that these are government-to-government investments from both India and China, and the US government agency, which used to be known as OPIC, which gave loans for private sector, gave loans to the private sector, has given them also $550 million to the West Terminal project. So we're getting support from the three major countries, India, China, and the US. That's positive. Hopefully our foreign policy is, going in the right direction. So there we are. So to summarize, stabilization has been impressive. We have to keep going. There has to be continuity. Poverty and hardship, major challenges. Unless we show people light at the end of the tunnel, it's going to be very difficult. And finally, we have to really get to grips with the structural reform agenda to get growth going and show people a light at the end of the tunnel as fast as possible. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've taken so long.
Thank you so much, Indrajit. Very fascinating presentation, but also a wonderful sort of overview of the problems the economy has had from the fiscal indiscipline that you mentioned and the macroeconomic issues, and of course getting into what corrective action has been taken. Loads of questions. I will try and group some of these questions together so you can get through as many as possible. Can I also ask everyone to stop sending in more questions because we have that many? Indrajit, also, if you could be brief in responding to questions so that we can get through as many as possible. The first one is from Rohan. Rohan Jalvis. So he asks, you refer to variances in GDP and forecasts from, the variances in GDP and other forecasts from the central bank versus the IMF. Why are these variations in forecasting happening? Because the data should be the same. Why are there these variations?
So, as you know, forecasting involves a number of assumptions. You make about, you have the backward-looking data is there, but when you look forward, you have to make certain assumptions about what is going to happen. And the IMF is well known for being very pessimistic in terms of its growth forecasts. Whereas we often are over-optimistic, it is true. But my own view is that we should be closer to 3% than 1.7% next year, all being well. Because now that you've talked about growth, we have a massive opportunity, and that is what is happening in India. If you look at what has happened in the Far East and Southeast Asia, when first Japan and then China had growth surges, all those countries were able to link into the supply chains in that region, and they all went up. Similarly, now India seems to be having a growth surge. Supply chains are getting relocated there for various reasons, including a political reason. So now what we need is to really link into what is happening in India in a big way. And that is the biggest chance of us getting onto a higher growth trajectory. So I think, if we can take advantage of that and also do the structural reforms in a systematic way, we can get the growth rates that the central bank is seeing rather than the IMF is seeing. And we can get growth of closer to 3% next year and closer to 4 or 5% going forward.
Thank you, Indrajit. The next set of questions, like I said, I've grouped together, are around the issue of corruption. So Mudita Gunasekara says, popular view is corruption is the root cause of the crisis. This view is expressed by opposition parties. However, in my view, you correctly pointed out the underlying issues. Can Sri Lanka recover from this corruption related matters? It's not just about macroeconomic policy, it's corruption is an issue. Segu Mazuk says, can we accept the view that the economy has stabilized when the ordinary man is undergoing severe difficulties in day-to-day living? So one around corruption, one around fact that the economy has stabilized, but the poor man is still suffering.
Sure. So on the first question on corruption, there's a big omission on my part. One of the pillars of the IMF program is tackling corruption vulnerabilities. And as you probably know, the IMF has just completed and given to the government a governance diagnostic. And that is now available. If you go to the IMF website and maybe even the Ministry of Finance website, that report is available. It is extremely distressing reading. The report is frank and exposes lots of vulnerabilities as far as corruption is concerned, right through the system at all levels. So it's not just the politicians, it's the officials, it's the private sector, everybody is involved in this. It's really seeped right into the system. And they have given 15 recommendations. Now, to be fair by the government, they agreed to this assessment to take place, and B, they have published it. But it's only in English at the moment. It is being translated into Sinhala and Tamil, and I'm told the translations will be completed by the end of the year. So early next year, the translations will be available. And as I said, there are 15 recommendations, and it is now up to all of us to make sure that those recommendations are taken forward. Now, the IMF is going to try to persuade the government to put those recommendations into the program proper, and so that then it will become part of the conditions of the program going forward. Every 6 months there's a program review, and if these recommendations, or at least the more important ones, are put into the program and reviewed every 6 months, then the government would need to meet those requirements to be able to go forward with the IMF program. And without the IMF program, we'll be in serious, serious trouble because we have difficulty in getting the money we need. So there's an opportunity presented by this governance diagnostic. There's also been a civil society diagnostic. So really, I think as a country, as a people, we need to look at these things and put enough pressure on the government to move forward on those recommendations. And the IMF also, this is a new area for the IMF. I suspect the intensity with which they pursue the implementation of these recommendations would depend to a significant extent on the feel they have of what's out there in the country. If the country really wants it, I suspect they will be bolder. Because this is a new area, if they don't see the real pressure coming up, they may not be as conscientious in monitoring and holding the government's feet to the fire. Thank you. The other one. I hope yes. I was able, other question. I was able to convey the fact that the macro indicators have improved significantly. But I hope the picture I gave of poverty in the country answers that question.
Yes.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So macroeconomic growth does not necessarily mean that all parts of the population are benefiting equally, and there are obviously losers in this situation as well, particularly with welfare being cut down. Yes. Helani raises this question. So populist policies have been a problem. Right now, there are unpopular policies that are being made, but Sri Lanka is going into an election year next year, and it is likely that one of the populist parties will come back into power. So what hope is there of breaking this cycle of fiscal indiscipline going forward?
But one thing is, if these frameworks, particularly if the public finance management bill goes through Parliament, at least we have laws. Okay, laws don't solve the whole problem. You have to implement them properly. But this time around, you can't do it through a letter from the Presidential Secretariat. You can't reverse policies through a letter from the Presidential Secretariat or from somewhere else. If you do, you break the law, right? And so the people have the protection of the law being there, and they can use the law to keep the, to tie the hands of the politicians and the senior policymakers. Now, the question is, have we learned the lessons we should have learned? And I go back to the Einstein definition of insanity. Are we going to do the same thing again? Despite, as I said, now the buffers are right down. People are suffering. If we again mess it up and then think we can go to the IMF and get a bailout later, one more round of austerity, and I think the whole thing can snap. I really do. So that, if Helani is the Helani, I think it is. Hi, Helani. But, this is really up to us as a country to realize that if we don't get it right this time, I suspect we will have a social implosion. Because then we will again spin out of control, have, the economy will overheat. We will start running out of dollars. We'll have high inflation, etc. will come back. And then we'll have to do austerity all over again as part of a new program. And the people can't take it this time. I don't think they can take any more of it. So I hope that everybody, the politicians, the policy, the bureaucrats, everybody understand that this time around we have to get it right. We really do. We don't have the scope to make any mistakes this time around.
Thank you, Indrajit. Nilmini Rollins asks about taxation policy. How could the current taxation policy be improved so that low middle income families do not suffer? And then she asks a related question. Do you think the current taxation policy of reducing the current taxation policy, along with expenditure cuts in education, and a lot of funds going out in terms of interest payments, will there be a disproportionate hit on low middle income populations as a result, and there'll be a lost generation of children because education will be severely damaged.
Yeah. So, okay, now, if you look at our budget, our expenditure is somewhere around 19-20% of GDP, which if you look at our comparative countries is okay. But what you need to do is to get our revenue up to about 15-16%. It went down to 8%, right? So there is no doubt we have to get more tax revenue. Now, one could argue that there's a disproportionate burden being placed on the poor through much higher VAT and the middle income groups. But there are property taxes in the pipeline. If you look at the original document, the IMF agreement, one of the requirements is that by January 2025, there will be a property tax. So the incidence of tax on the higher income groups will go up with the introduction of a property tax, which hopefully will make it a more progressive structure of taxation. I think the government's intention is to really make a big push on tax administration, because we have this very, very narrow tax base. The number of tax identification tax files are very, very low. So there were some interesting measures in this year's budget, in November budget. You can no longer have major transactions without a tax identification number, i.e., you can't open a bank account, you can't purchase land, you can't purchase a motor vehicle, or register a motor vehicle, you can't purchase property. All these things now, the relevant government agency, whether it's the RMB, the condominium authority, or the land registry, or whatever it is, they will not give you the required certification without a tax identification number. So hopefully that will increase the number of taxpayers, because there's widespread evasion and avoidance of tax in Sri Lanka, particularly amongst the professionals. So hopefully they won't be able to spend money on anything very significant without a tax identification number. Now this has to get implemented effectively, but at least that has been brought in. And that, in an ideal world, should increase the tax base. If the tax base increases and the tax collection increases, it may be possible to give, and that's the intention now, over time, to give relief to people in the middle, which Women is talking about, by increasing the threshold on when personal income tax kicks in, and to widen the slabs. So that is where they want to move to. But for that, they have to start collecting. Their tax administration has to improve significantly. They also have to use the technology they've had for years. There's a technology called RAMIS, Revenue Administration Management Information System, given to us by the Singaporeans. Now we have got an upgraded version as well, but it's never been implemented, because if you read the IMF's governance diagnostic, you will know why. When they talk about corruption at every level. Because the Inland Revenue Department wants to have at least one face-to-face contact with the taxpayers. Because of that, they don't introduce, or have not over the years, introduced this technology. This technology, basically, it's like what we have in the UK. We can go into an online system, and it has the capacity to directly link online all the major agencies of government which handle with high-value transactions, i.e., the registrar of motor vehicle, the condominium authority, the customs, all the other agencies, land registry, which deal with high-value transactions, can be linked directly to the Indian Revenue Department, so that if there anybody has a single transaction in these areas, automatically the Indian Revenue Department gets that information. So that technology is supposed to be introduced. I think it was supposed to be introduced in September. Now I'm told they'll introduce it by the end of the year. So we need to use that technology. You know, one of the things, because I kind of rushed at the end, in terms of strengthening the growth framework, is digitalization. So a couple of things to mention there: digitalization, agricultural modernization, and education and health are areas which we have to really prioritize going forward.
Thank you. So we are about 10 minutes over time, so I think we'll take a few last questions. Rohan asks, Sri Lanka liberalized its economy in 97-78, India much afterwards in 91. They too went bankrupt like we did earlier, but India has made positive progress while Sri Lanka negative. Indian politicians also play politics and subsidizes, the various parts of the economy to win elections. So what is it that we have done over and above what India has done to be in the situation we're currently in?
Basically, for instance, the Indian system, in terms of checks and balances, is still stronger. In our case, the political sphere dominates every aspect of our life. And I think, for instance, the Indian administrative service is able to push back much more in terms of having prudent policies than our system has been able to do, because our things have become much more politicized. And so India made similar mistakes to us, but the extent of the mistakes has not been as great, really. They've had fiscal imbalances, but it didn't get to the point that it got to in our case. And also the fiscal dominance of the Reserve Bank of India. The Reserve Bank of India didn't get as politicized as the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So in that way, while they made similar mistakes, the gravity of those mistakes were not as great as ours.
Thank you. The final question, and this is from Uditha. Now, we talked earlier about corruption more from sort of the government standpoint, but here he's asking about corruption in relation to businesses. He says that recently Wickramaratne mentioned that in Parliament that only 2 companies in Sri Lanka have been blacklisted for their practices, whereas say in Bangladesh, for instance, hundreds of businesses there are blacklisted. Any thoughts about how we can weed out corruption in relation to business?
So from what I've only read the executive summary of the corruption diagnostic from the IMF, they look at this problem as well. Essentially, we have the private sector is as guilty as anybody else. So we have basically corruption in the political level, we have corruption in the official level, we have corruption in the business level. There's corruption all across. And essentially, our businesses are very averse to competition. Essentially, what they want to do is to rig the rules in their favor and to pay the rent that you need to do to rig the rules in their favor. So that is what the private sector has been doing that. They essentially have, not all of them, but a significant component of the private sector has been part of this kind of whole rent-seeking cycle. And policies have also, one of the reasons why we have an anti-export bias in our policy mix is because the large kind of businesses catering to the domestic market have been strong and have been able to tilt policy in their favor. So this whole practice of not having competition, essentially, now Vietnam, I was talking to a person from Vietnam at the Economic Summit. He said that they are very focused on competition. And whereas here, In Sri Lanka, we are quite averse to competition, really. And as I said, the businesses get involved in this rent-seeking behavior in order to make sure that the rules are set in their favor. So that also has to really be addressed over time.
Thank you, Indrajit. So we are now about 15 minutes over time, so I would like to conclude the question and answer session. I apologize, I was not able to get to all questions, but I think I've managed to get to every person, as at least one of your questions has been answered. Indrajit, thank you so much for your fascinating talk today. I think, you know, we frequently talk to you about you being the former governor at the central bank, but also I think what we saw today was that because of the amount of experience you have working the different departments at the central bank and your experiences with various policymakers over the years, that has certainly made this talk today so wide-ranging, very comprehensive, and your knowledge, you know, we are very privileged to have access to your knowledge and understanding of affairs, particularly at a very critical time of the Sri Lankan economy. So again, a heartfelt thank you for taking time from your diary and your time back in Sri Lanka to come back to us and support APSL with this very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Indrajit. I would also like to thank the audience today. You've taken time away from your Sunday afternoon to join this talk, and without an audience, we can't really have a successful talk. So I appreciate your time and participation, and continue to support APSL by engaging in these talks, but also by supporting the various projects that we have undertaken. For instance, the renewable energy projects we've talked about earlier in this talk. And again, the links have been provided to you by Dr. Samarasinha in the chat. As we mentioned earlier, this WE Sri Lanka talk is being recorded and it will be made available on the APSL YouTube channel in due course. So may I take this opportunity again to thank you for joining us, and we will be in touch about other talks and project updates going forward. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening in the case of people joining from Sri Lanka, and we hope to see you very soon. This is Gihantha Jayasinghe for the APSL WE Sri Lanka project. Goodbye now.
Thank you very much, Gihantha, and thank you very much to all of you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.